Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, and what life was like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining me is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He offers both public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he centers on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, also Granby and Amherst as well, and his tour spotlight on the canals, reservoirs, cemeteries and churches, parks, houses, and streets. And he personally gives all of his presentations and tours himself. So in today's episode, we will be discussing the North Cemetery located in the community of Granby. So tell us about the North Cemetery of Granby.
All right, in Granby there's two cemeteries, and we're going to discuss the north one today, but there's also the West Cemetery. And today we're also going to talk about when this cemetery started, what are some of the families that started up, and about the neighborhood that's around it. All right, so this cemetery, I believe the following has happened. The Baptist denomination within the Protestant religion tries to get away from the Congregationalist religion all the time. Roger Williams got away from Boston Congregationalists. He fled, and he made a new place that would be Rhode Island, where he started the Baptist religion. He wanted his own way of performing his religious duties. And that happened over and over again around the United States, especially around New England. And it happened, for instance, in Springfield, the Baptists fled to East Long Meadow and started their own church and cemetery there. It happened in Springfield again when the Baptists went north this time to Ireland Parish, which would become Holyoke, and formed the Baptist community there with a church and cemetery. It happened twice in South Hadley. The first one time was they fled from Chicopee, which was Springfield at that time, into what was South Hadley, started up a church and cemetery. But it happened again in the South Hadley region, but it was actually became Granby later. This North Cemetery was part of South Hadley in 1764 when the cemetery was started. And it was started up because the family wanted to get, the families that were Baptists wanted to get away, probably this time from the Hadley Congregationalists. They fled off to what would become Granby and started their own place there, always trying to get away. And so that's why you find these obscure little cemeteries that have a lot of Baptists in them, always very small because they don't last very long. So they might have, 100 burials, 200 burials only. That's it.
And so why was the cemetery started?
Okay, I think it was started for this reason. A person named Seth Clark and his wife, Mary Edwards, had a couple of very young children. Now, Seth Clark was a Baptist minister, and a couple of his children died very, very young, Levi Clark and Ruth Clark. And I think that he wanted to keep away from the Congregationalists. He had gone from Hadley to Granby, and then he had moved onwards to, I think, Wilbraham on Ludlow after that. But he had kept his land in Granby. And one of his children, Levi Clark, his son, would die very young. He would only live a year and about 5 months. He would die on the 11th of January, 1764, at the age of 1, and he would be buried back in Granby, even though he would have died in Wilbraham. All right, I think the father kept some of his land where he kept one of his Baptist ministries going. And also another of their child, Ruth Clark, died at 1 month old or 2 months old on the 6th of June, 1767. So Levi Clark would be the first buried of all. And the only thing is that they wanted to have their own place away from the Congregationalists. So North Cemetery is just that. But along the way, it might have turned into a bit of a family cemetery and then a neighborhood cemetery because a lot of Clarks are there. And a lot of people that lived along Bachelor Street, which is the place it's on, are also buried there. So it had a very obscure beginning, and I think I'm right because I've looked at the history of so many cemeteries.
And so quickly before we continue with our interview, just to fill listeners in, for more information or to sign up for various tours, check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each tour, as well as photos and text of the historical sites as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, what are some of the families that are buried here?
All right. Well, if you go walking around the cemetery, you see a lot of names occur over and over again. One of them is Elliot Ferry. He died in 1862 in Annapolis, Maryland. He was a soldier for the Northern Force. So he was a Union soldier that died for the cause, and he was brought back to Granby and buried here. All right. You also find a lot of the Smith family, the Green family, the Weatherby family, the Ayres family, Ayres, and then the Preston family, a lot of those, and they were the founders of South Hadley and thus of Granby, the Hunter family, the Newell family, right, and a lot of them are buried here, and they also had houses around the area. So if you'd ever take a walk on Bachelor Street, you'll find that a lot of these burials match the houses that were around here. And there's some very old houses around there.
And what about the neighborhood near the cemetery?
Okay, so if you're going on a tour of North Cemetery that I plan for the year 2024, I'll tell you where the houses is. And I'm also going to drop a map so you can see the stones within the cemetery and match them to the houses that they owned on Bachelor Street. Most of them are a little bit north or east of the cemetery on Bachelor Street. And I'll tell you a few of the key ones along the way. Samuel Ayres and Martha Bell had a house at 218 Bachelor Street, and Martha is buried in North Cemetery, and her house is about a mid-1700s colonial house in a salt box style, and that's very rare. Then there was also Eliza Ayres and Sybil Clark, buried at 232 Bachelor Street, Elephant Green and Mercy Selden at 326 Bachelor Street, David Cook and Lucinda Taylor at 7 School Street, and S.L. Smith and his wife at 117 Bachelor Street. All right, so these are some of the people buried here, and their homes are mostly on Bachelor Street, and usually very, very close by.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of expertise. And thank you to our sponsors. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And check out a large selection of our other podcasts at his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new podcasts and videos posted daily. Thank you, and hope you join us again. Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, and what life is like in the industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining me is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He offers both public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout Massachusetts. Currently, the communities that he centers on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, also Granby and Amherst as well. In his tour spotlight on the canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, and also parks, houses, and streets. He personally gives all of his presentations and tours himself, and in today's episode we will be discussing the West Street Cemetery, located in the community of Granby, Massachusetts. So tell us of the layout of the West Street Cemetery.
West Street Cemetery is laid out such that when you enter the gates from West Street, you come into the modern part first, and then as you go deeper in towards the southeast, you come to a section that was laid out from about 1870 to 1910 and has many burials from that era and a lot of ornate stones because a lot of people were buying ornate stones in that era, more so than before or after. So you go modern and then Victorian, ornate, and then you keep going in, and what you find is that you come to the very oldest burials of all. Now remember, this is the town-owned cemetery, and it was started a year after the town was started, and that means 1769 it started the cemetery. And so you have some very old burials there. And where are they? You have to go deep into the cemetery, almost near Kellogg Street. And then all of a sudden you find these very, very old burials. All right, it just so happens that a few of the burials are older than 1769. How is that possible? Well, I'll tell you during the course of this. And also about one very modern burial that's of great note. And then, why was the cemetery even located in this town at this point? It's not very obvious, but a little clue. This used to be the center of Granby. You might not recognize that as such, but it did.
And tell us of the two reburials here.
All right, there's two confirmed reburials, and what I mean by that, the bodies were taken out of another cemetery, not in Granby, and brought into Granby and buried here in the West Street Cemetery. And those two were from 1903 disinterments from the old South Hadley Cemetery that was on College Street in South Hadley. This was during a move from 1902, 1903, and 1904, where bodies were being taken out of that cemetery and being mostly put into the Evergreen Cemetery behind the old Sahay burial ground. And who are the burials? Samuel Dickinson, who was the husband of Esther White, and Samuel Moody. Now, I know these for sure because a professor at Mount College in 1903 with her students took a listing of all the stones that were left in the old Sahai burial ground in that year. Any stones from 1902 that were moved beforehand she didn't catch, but she caught the ones that were there in 1903 and, of course, in 1904 moves. So you can look at that list, and I noticed that Samuel Dickinson of this family in this correct burial year and Samuel Moody of that year, both had roots in South Hadley, were moved to Granby because their families had moved off to Granby in the interim between their deaths. And so these two burials are confirmed to be part of the move. Now, Samuel Dickinson died in 1751, and remember, there was no Granby yet, there was no cemetery here yet, and Samuel Moody died in 1765, again, the same occurrence, and thus I found two burials in Granby moved from South Hadley. Now, in 1902, movements of body out of the Osai burial ground, these people were not recorded on the Professor Soul's disinterment list from 1903, but projected there might be five other people. A Mahitable Smith, wife of Ebenezer Taylor, an Ebenezer Taylor, an infant son of the Taylors, Elizabeth Smith, and a Roche Smith. All are quite possible to have been taken out of the old Sahai burial ground and moved into this West Street Cemetery. Their relatives had to show up at that old Sahai burial ground and say, we want the body moved here. And South Hadley would move the body in the stone for free and buy a new plot of land in the West Street Cemetery.
And quickly before we continue with our interview, just to fill our listeners in, for more information or to sign up for various tours, check out his website at hoyokecanaltour.org. And there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each tour, as well as photos and text of the historical sites as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun educational outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, tell us about any modern burials of note.
Okay, usually I don't pay particularly much attention to modern burials in any cemetery. I usually have 100-year rule, or a rule that they must have been a person that died during the war. But in this cemetery, I'll make an exception. Patricia Tucker was murdered by her husband in the year of 1978. Her body was found off Easton Street on November 18th by some children playing in the woods. They noticed a skeleton tucked below a log. And it was not until 44 years later, through DNA analysis of touch DNA, was the body even identified. So her stone, and it was put here by Granby residents who paid for the stone, says unknown, November 18th, 1978, in God's care. And her son put his DNA on a national database, and they were able to match her finally off a tiny bit of DNA remnants that they had found. They had to pull out her body to get new samples, and it matched. So finally, she was able to be identified as such. She had been missing since that year, and she was thought to have been killed, last seen in Chicopee, and she thought to have been killed either in Chicopee or Granby, and brought out, dragged to this location. And this location back then was very, very remote, so no one saw what happened. So thankfully, they've been able to do this. Since that point, the husband has died, so no criminal charges will be brought. But they want to get a new stone for her. It says Patricia Ann Tucker.
And why is the cemetery located here?
Okay, the center of Granby, in its early history of 1768, when it was formed as a town, had its meeting house in the center, right at the crossing of Amherst Street and West Street. Now there's only about 5 or 6 old homes there. There's no meeting house. It doesn't look like a center. But it was a center. And every center needs not only that church, but a school. And it needs a cemetery. And the cemetery is located here because of that reason. So I'm going to give a tour in the West Street Cemetery in the year 2024. And after looking at one sample in the modern section, one sample in the Victorian section, and many samples in the old section, we're going to walk out to that corner of Amherst and West Streets and look at some of the families that lived there and what the layout must have been. So you'll get a sense of what this whole area might have looked like.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And thank you to our sponsors. And of course, we want to thank our listeners for tuning in.